Welcome to Beat Diabetes, and we're going to talk about the vegan diet today, share a few comments from people who have been vegan and didn't have the greatest experience. And I'm not going to condemn all those that are on a vegan diet. I think there is a way to make it work. We'll talk about that, but these people, it didn't work for. So let's get started. This individual says, when I went vegan for almost a year, I lost some teeth, bleeding gums, inflammation, arthritis, sugar spikes, till I reached 500 milligrams per deciliter glucose reading. So this individual at least is recording and testing their blood sugar. And he's like, well, I'm getting spikes, and then it's getting higher and higher. Finally, he has one up to 500 milligrams per deciliter, which is terrible. I mean, we're not just talking about not so good. It's absolutely terrible. He says, I panicked. Well, you should. Panic is all right if you're in a situation where you need to panic. Sometimes we act like all panic is bad. Well, in this case, panic that leads to a change is exactly what's needed. So, lost teeth, bleeding gums, inflammation, arthritis, sugar spikes, and so forth. The biggest problem with the vegan diet, in my estimation, generally speaking, is that people assume it simply involves what you don't eat, and they don't worry much about what you do eat. Now, that's not true for everybody. And some of you that follow my channel are vegans, and I'm happy to have you. But I think as a whole, in many cases, people go vegan and they go, all right, no animal products, no meat, no dairy, no cheese, and I'm good to go. The rest doesn't hardly matter. Yeah, the rest matters a great deal. Now, to be fair, there are many vegans who say, well, we believe in the whole food veganism, so that means you don't go into the Little Debbie department and buy a bunch of sugary snacks. And so some vegans eat somewhat healthy. But here's the problem with the average vegan diet and the average person who does the vegan. The problem is real simple. You have to eat something. I mean, you can't get any more basic than that, right? You have to eat something. And so if you say, I'm not going to eat animal products, which typically are where you find the lowest carbs, and I'm going to eat plant products, which typically is where you find the most carbs, then you're going from either a medium carb diet or maybe a low carb diet to usually a high carb diet. So a lot of people assume if it's natural, I'm not going to be eating little pastries and candies and snacks. But if it's natural, like potatoes, like rice, like pasta and so forth, it's okay. And what that will often mean is you end up going to a high carb diet, high carbohydrate diet, which for someone who has diabetic tendencies, metabolic issues, insulin resistance is about the worst thing you can do. I know because that's exactly what happened to me when I was starting to have my metabolic system break down and my blood sugar was bouncing all over the place. I read an article from a guy who said the answer to diabetes is to go whole foods, plant-based. And so I started just eating things that weren't meat. My idea was pretty much what these guys. I wasn't a total vegan. I was more of a vegetarian, but I did away with the meat. And my blood sugar got 10 times worse. It was terrible. It was so much worse. Because again, you have to eat something. So if I'm not going to eat meat, I'm going to eat carbs or foods that have quite a few carbs in them. So you almost have to do that. Now, there are creative ways if you're really determined to be a vegan and you're determined, I don't want the animal products, but I don't want to have my glucose go sky high either. There are ways to do it. You're going to have like the most restrictive diet ever. It's going to be far more restrictive than a typical vegetarian diet, far more restrictive than a typical low-carb diet. I mean, your choices become limited for sure, and that's putting it mildly, but it can be done. And if you're determined, I want to do the vegan thing, then you're going to have to find a way to do low carb if you've really got diabetic issues. Now, there is another issue, and that is making sure you get the kind of nutrition that you need. This person was not only saying my blood sugar is going off the charts, He's saying, I've got inflammation, I've got arthritis, I've got bleeding gums, I've got teeth falling out. So, and I'm no expert on nutrition or anything like that, but I can say this much: when things aren't working, it's time for a change. Let me just repeat and rewind that, baby. When things aren't working and you've given it a good, honest try, you've tried for some time and they just don't work, and you're falling apart and your blood sugar's off the charts, then it's probably time to try something else. But you wouldn't know if your blood sugar's off the charts if you don't ever test yourself with a glucose meter. And that's one reason we need to test, and say, well, how's it working? Not how's it working according to Dr. Neil Bernard, not how's it working according to Dr. Jason Fung, not how's it working according to Dennis Pollock. How's it working according to Mike the glucose meter? What does Mike think about this diet? And there are some people that promote certain high-starch diets. They don't want you to even talk to Mike. It's like, don't talk to Mike. Oh, he's an evil guy. He's not in it for your good. He's a conspiracy theorist. He's not a wise person. Don't have anything to do with Mike the glucose meter. And I'd say, no, Mike is your best friend. He's a far better friend than I can ever be to you as a diabetic. So check it out with your glucose meter and see what your glucose meter tells you. Here's another one. I was a vegan for nearly 10 years. Early on, it was great. I was chomping away, working hard, creating recipes filled with tons of veggies, potatoes, sweet potatoes, beans, tofu, noodles, salads, whole wheat breads, oatmeal, quinoa, rice, tons of fruit, smoothies, veganese. I didn't know there was such a thing. I guess it's a substitute for mayonnaise, veganese, vegan meats, vegan desserts, vegan butters. Though through time, I found myself feeling hungrier, and I developed athlete's foot on my right foot, plus feeling itchy all over my body. I was gaining lots and lots of weight with a protruding stomach. As time continued, I found myself feeling as if I was always starving, so I ate until one day I realized I was hurting myself. Took this individual a while, but after a while they start adding up what's going on in their body and what's going on in their life, fact that they're always hungry and having all kinds of issues. And they say, you know what? This isn't working. I think some of the most powerful words in the human language, in the vocabulary of English-speaking people, are the simple words, this isn't working. Because once you say that, it's almost always going to be followed by another thought, I've got to change. This isn't working. I've got to change. This isn't working. I've got to change. That's exactly what happened to me. When I was having my blood sugar bouncing all over the place and I went vegetarian for a while and I started eating more carbs, there was a point where I said, this isn't working. Let me read a few more books. Let me do a little more research because this sure ain't working. And I did make those changes. So he says, this isn't working. He says, I've got on YouTube and found Dennis and Dr. Berg and realized I was in metabolic trouble. I'm slowly turning this ship around day by day, feeling amazingly better. Thanks to you, Dennis, and the other low-carb YouTubers. You're all so gracious to share your knowledge. Very grateful to all of you. So he's made the change. Doesn't sound like he's there yet with everything fully resolved and everything perfectly normal, but boy, he's happy. He's going the right direction. He's made the change. Well, once again, you don't even need to watch YouTube videos. We are a help, I will admit, and people can get helped and inspired by watching videos like these. But that glucose meter is so powerful. If all somebody could do, and if there was no YouTube, and if there were no nutritionists to talk about low carb and intermittent fasting and time-restricted eating and all that kind of stuff, if they could just hand you a glucose meter, most of you could be smart enough to figure out what you needed to do if you took enough time and did enough tests. It helps to read books. It helps to watch YouTube videos. Absolutely. And by watching the videos, you can more or less stand on the shoulders of those of us that have gone before you, and you can gain from our experiences. So yeah, it definitely helps. But if you had none of this, no YouTube, none of the other, no books, just a glucose meter, that by itself could pretty much do the job. It would take longer, but you could get there. So, and One other thing to say is sometimes on these higher carb diets, your A1C is still pretty decent. It's not like you can't have a decent A1C on a higher carb diet. Some people cannot. They're too far gone. They've crossed over that diabetic boundary and it's out of sight. It's way in the background. And there's no way they'll ever have a decent A1C again if they don't do low carb. Some people can have a reasonably good A1C, maybe in the 5s or low 6s, but they're spiking all over the place. They're jumping up, diving down, jumping up, diving down. And that by itself is not a healthy thing at all. It is hurting you. And it's just a foreshadowing of worse things to come, because if you have enough time jumping up, diving down, guess what? A day will come where the diving down will no longer occur. You'll be jumping up and staying up and then slowly coming down a bit. And by that time, it's time for your next meal. And you jump up and very slowly start to come down, but you never quite make it. And then you have a snack or another meal, and off you go again. The diving down no longer occurs because you have been abusing your metabolic system, your pancreas, your liver for too long, and you won't have that. Now, if you're younger and fit, you might be a type 1 diabetic. And you can jump up and down all day long because you've got no insulin resistant. You're strong, you're buff, you're muscular, not a trace of fat on you. And so you'll do the jump up and go and dive down. Or you may be a type 2 with the same thing. But you're still spiking way too much. So just because you're not overweight doesn't mean you don't have potential issues. And the real question is, how much of a spike are you getting? And that's why I focus on a low spike diet. I don't even call it keto. I don't call it really low carb. I talk about those. I use those terms. But really what I'm talking about is watching those spikes, finding out when you tend to hit your peak, which is usually about an hour after you eat or an hour and a half. Occasionally it could be 2 hours. But finding out when you peak, not when your mama peaks, not when I peak. When do you peak normally? And different foods will affect you differently. And then making sure that your spikes aren't too big. Now, when your glucose is sky high, then don't expect that you're going to be able to keep your peak under 140 like I have sometimes recommended. And these days for me, it's under 130. But you won't be able to do that. You'll wake up in the morning with a 280 or a 320 milligrams per deciliter. So there's no way you can say, well, I'm going to keep my glucose under 140. No, you can't right now. The good news is you probably will be able to at some point. So in the beginning stages, what you want is just don't jump up too high. If you're at 280 or 300 when you start your meal, then an hour afterwards, where did you go? If you're up to 500, too much. If you're up to 400, too much. But if you start your meal at 300 milligrams per deciliter and then an hour later, hour and a half later, and you're like 330, well, that's not too bad. So that's where you start. Just see that you don't peak too high and you're not jumping way too high. And guess what? Eventually that baseline level will come down. You won't be waking up at 300 forever. After a while, you'll wake up in the morning with a 220 milligrams per deciliter, and then a 180, and then a 160. And lo and behold, you'll have that amazing hallelujah day when you wake up and it's under 100. Most people can see that. If you're type 1, of course, you need insulin. If you're a LATA, you're going to need insulin. But for most type 2s, they can see that hallelujah day. But it'll take some time, so don't expect it's going to happen. Some people will write into me and they'll say, well, Dennis, I've been at this 3 weeks and my blood sugar hasn't changed. I don't usually respond to that at all because, number one, I don't give personal advice about your particular situation. But in my mind, I am thinking, well, of course it hasn't changed. Give it some time. I usually won't even say that, though. I'll let them figure that out. But I'm saying to you, because now I'm not talking to an individual, I'm talking to a group, and I'm saying to you as a group, don't think that in 2 or 3 weeks you're going to see major victory. There may be a few, not many. So give it some time. If you've recently been diagnosed with diabetes and you've just discovered this channel, let me recommend that you go to our Uploads page, which will give you access to every diabetic video we've posted since we began. As you work your way through all our videos, I believe you'll find the help you need. A link to our Uploads page is in the description.